Have you ever noticed how, in our culture, being called an intellectual sometimes feels like a subtle insult rather than a compliment?
Oh, absolutely. It often carries this slight edge to it.
Right. Think about it for a second. If someone calls you intelligent or smart or practical, you take it as high praise. You feel valued. But if someone describes you as an intellectual, there's often this lingering implication that perhaps you're a bit out of touch.
Like you're maybe a little elitist.
Exactly. We're just lacking in basic, everyday common sense. Welcome to this episode, presented by Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. We're so glad you're joining this podcast today because we're exploring exactly where that cultural reflex comes from, why it's so deeply ingrained in us, and what it actually means for our society.
It's a profound cultural dynamic. And to help us navigate these complex ideas today, we want to share something special with you. Experience a unique two-voice AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. This method allows us to synthesize the massive historical landscape you're about to cover, bringing the most vital insights directly to you.
And the roadmap for our conversation today is a true masterpiece of historical analysis. We are looking at Richard Hofstadter's sweeping Pulitzer Prize-winning book from 1964 titled Anti-Intellectualism in American Life.
It's a phenomenal piece of work. When you read these pages, you immediately see why he won the Pulitzer for general nonfiction.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore how American society has repeatedly turned intellect from a public virtue into something seen as unmanly, elitist, or even un-American. More importantly, we want to figure out what that historical shift means for our modern democracy.
Setting that foundation is critical, primarily because of the common assumption most people hold about this topic. If you ask the average person today about the public distrust of experts, or the general hostility toward profound, complex thought, they'll usually frame it as a very recent phenomenon.
Right, they blame the internet.
Exactly. They might point to the internet age, the rise of social media algorithms, or modern political polarization. The general feeling is that we just recently lost our way, and that back in the good old days, we all deeply respected careful, nuanced thinkers.
That is the narrative we hear all the time. People treat anti-intellectualism like it's a modern glitch in the system. But Hofstadter's work completely shatters that assumption. He argues that this hostility isn't a recent accident at all. Instead, it's deeply woven into the very fabric of American history.
It really is. It's been there since the beginning, growing and evolving right alongside our most cherished institutions. What's fascinating here is the crucial distinction Hofstadter makes right at the outset of his argument. To grasp his historical thesis, we have to understand how he separates two words that we use interchangeably in casual conversation.
Intelligence and intellect.
Exactly. Hofstadter argues that American culture highly, almost fiercely, values intelligence. Intelligence, in his specific definition, seeks useful, practical knowledge. It focuses on clear goals and efficient problem solving.
So it's the quality that helps you write a better software program, cure a disease, or scale a profitable business.
Right. America loves and rewards intelligence. It builds economies.
But intellect operates on a completely different frequency in his framework. While intelligence is busy solving the immediate problem at hand, intellect is the quality that steps back and examines the problem itself. It's critical, creative, and contemplative.
It turns comfortable answers into entirely new, often uncomfortable questions. Intellect values reflection for its own sake, rather than demanding an immediate practical application.
And that captures the friction perfectly. Hofstadter points out that as America expanded access to education, which had wonderfully admirable egalitarian aims, it also fueled a deeply utilitarian mindset.
The culture started prizing immediate practicality while actively distrusting reflective inquiry. The core argument of the book is that anti-intellectualism in America is fundamentally a resentment of the life of the mind.
It's a cultural hostility toward those who represent that life, portraying them as pretentious, immoral, or simply unnecessary.
And this resentment is paired with a fierce faith that the plain sense of the common person is inherently superior to formal knowledge and expertise.
So when you look back at the early days of the country, how did that specific attitude take root so deeply? I mean, we didn't just wake up one day deciding to distrust philosophers and value mechanics above all else.
No, we didn't. Hofstadter traces this back to three main historical pillars that built this cultural attitude from the ground up. The first major pillar is evangelical Protestantism.
Now, early American Protestantism, particularly the Puritan tradition, actually helped spread literacy and fostered some incredibly rigorous, highly intellectual strands of theological thought.
They absolutely did. They founded major universities. But the landscape shifted dramatically with the rise of revivalist evangelicalism, particularly during the Great Awakenings. This new movement brought a very different perspective to the frontier.
And when you have a culture suddenly celebrating raw, emotional religious conversion, where does that leave the traditional university-trained minister?
It leaves them highly marginalized. The revivalist tradition emphasized the warm heart over the trained mind. Picture a passionate circuit-riding preacher out in a tent revival, speaking directly to the daily struggles of the people.
That immediate emotional experience of faith was prioritized over careful, rigorous study in a quiet seminary library.
Exactly. The movement championed the spirit over intellectual rigor. Hofstadter shows how this nurtured a broader religious culture that became deeply suspicious of abstract thought. It celebrated simple, unlearned piety as something much more authentic, pure, and democratic than formal theological learning.
That imagery really helps visualize the shift. And it wasn't just happening in religious tents, it was happening out in the physical wilderness, too. Which ties into the second pillar. Hofstadter identifies frontier individualism.
The pioneer culture of early America faced a harsh reality where survival was the only metric that mattered. Out on the frontier, you needed to know how to clear a forest, plant crops, build a shelter, and survive a brutal winter.
You certainly didn't need a degree in classical philosophy to keep your family alive.
No, you needed grit. Hofstadter calls this the libertarian worship of practical skills. This intense frontier environment encouraged the pervasive belief that real, valuable knowledge only comes from direct, hands-on experience.
It forged a culture that instinctively distrusted knowledge that came from books or distant experts.
And in this emerging national narrative, intellectuals were geographically and culturally tied to eastern cities and established wealthy institutions. Because the scholars weren't out in the mud-building cabins, the frontier culture easily cast them as out of touch, soft, or even parasitic on the hard physical labor of the common people.
As those frontier towns eventually grew into booming industrial cities, that exact same survival instinct seemed to mutate. The values of the frontier transformed seamlessly into the values of the modern marketplace, which brings us to the third historical pillar, business culture.
Right. Hofstadter argues that business has been the most powerful and pervasive interest in American life. He describes a phenomenon he calls the mystique of practicality.
Within American business culture, we saw the rise of the powerful cult of the self-made man.
This gospel of raw experience heavily reinforced the idea that formal prolonged schooling is somewhat suspect. If you can learn it on the factory floor or the trading floor, why sit in a classroom?
We still see echoes of this everywhere today, don't we? Think about modern hustle culture or the tech bro pragmatism of move fast and break things.
Oh, absolutely. There's this pervasive idea that if an idea doesn't scale, monetize, or disrupt an industry immediately, it's a waste of time.
It narrows the entire view of a successful life down to commercial success.
That's a highly accurate modern parallel. Within this mystique of practicality, theoretical reflection is viewed either as a useless luxury or a dangerous hindrance to getting things done. If you're pausing to reflect on the moral implications of what you're building, you're losing the race to the market.
And Hofstadter warns that this mindset is spiritually crippling because it completely marginalizes the life of the mind.
When you braid these three strands together, evangelical piety, frontier pragmatism, and business utilitarianism, you begin to see how popular anti-intellectualism gained such incredibly deep moral and emotional roots in our society.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Hofstadter doesn't just leave these observations in the realm of history or abstract cultural theory. He takes us directly into the American classroom.
Yes, he spends a substantial portion of the book examining how our educational system itself became ground zero for these exact tensions. It's arguably the most vital part of his analysis.
He explores the inherent tension between access and excellence in American schooling.
He looks closely at the progressive era, specifically critiquing aspects of Deweyne progressive education and the movement that followed, known as life adjustment education.
To be completely impartial, it's important to state that these movements started with highly democratic, well-intentioned goals. John Dewey and his followers wanted to make school useful and engaging for everyone.
They focused on civic participation and learning by doing, rather than just forcing a wealthy elite to memorize Latin grammar for university preparation.
Those sound like wonderful democratic goals on the surface. How does a movement designed to help every student end up doing a disservice to the intellect?
The problem arose in how those theories were practically applied, especially as they morphed into the life adjustment movement of the 1940s and 50s. In the attempt to make education universally relevant, the movement systematically diluted rigorous academic content.
Let's look at what this actually meant in a mid-century classroom. Instead of demanding challenging intellectual work like deep historical analysis or rigorous mathematics, schools began shifting their focus towards socialization and vocational skills.
You would literally have high school courses dedicated to dating etiquette, personal hygiene, or how to use a telephone properly.
It's wild to think about a curriculum replacing history with dating etiquette.
The primary intention shifted from developing the mind to helping the students simply fit comfortably into society.
And to justify this massive watering down of academics, educators leaned heavily on the early science of standardized testing. Can you break down how IQ tests were misused during this era to support this shift?
This is a sobering piece of educational history. Early in the 20th century, as standardized IQ testing became more prevalent, some influential educators severely misinterpreted the data.
They took highly questionable interpretations of these tests to argue that roughly 60% of the student population simply lacked the innate capacity to have their minds developed beyond a very minimal basic level.
They categorized these students as essentially unteachable when it came to complex, abstract thought.
If the educational establishment fundamentally believes that more than half their students can't handle real academics, the natural result is going to be a curriculum that asks almost nothing of them intellectually.
That's the tragic outcome Hofstadter highlights. They used this flawed interpretation to justify offering non-intellectual curricula to the masses. Furthermore, there was a strange egalitarian suspicion at play. Intensive intellectual development was often branded as elitist or un-American.
Demanding high academic rigor was viewed as inherently undemocratic because not everyone could achieve the same baseline results.
But then the geopolitical landscape shifted overnight, completely upending this philosophy. Just as these life adjustment courses were becoming the unquestioned norm in American high schools, October 1957 arrived, and the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite.
The beep-beep of that satellite orbiting the Earth sent an absolute shockwave of panic through the United States. It changed the entire educational conversation in a matter of weeks.
The complexity of the modern world, the terrifying stakes of the Cold War, and rising parental education levels suddenly collided.
The public realized that knowing advanced physics and rigorous mathematics wasn't an elitist luxury. It was a matter of national survival.
The Sputnik scare violently pushed public opinion back toward demanding serious, rigorous schooling. Suddenly, the nation realized that a lack of intellectual rigor was a profound vulnerability. It forced a massive reevaluation of what schools should actually be demanding of their students.
That Cold War panic perfectly sets the stage for the political context of the book itself. We have to remember the era in which Hofstadter was writing. It was the early 1960s, and he was working in the direct shadow of the 1950s anti-communist crusades.
Specifically, the era of McCarthyism.
Exactly. To truly understand the power of this book, we must contextualize the author's environment. During the McCarthy era, independent inquiry and critical thought were frequently framed as literal threats to national security.
Professors, writers, and public intellectuals were routinely targeted, investigated, and smeared as disloyal or subversive simply for engaging in the life of the mind. And as we discuss this, we remain completely impartial regarding modern politics, focusing entirely on Hofstadter's historical framing of these mid-century events.
Hofstadter makes an incredibly compelling case that McCarthyism was a climactic episode of anti-intellectual passion. He uses some vivid language to describe the era, characterizing it as having an atmosphere of fervent malice and humorless imbecility.
The political establishment wasn't just investigating spies. They were actively directing malice at intellectuals, universities, and the very concept of nuanced thought.
Hofstadter identifies a profound danger in this dynamic, and it highlights a major strength in the book's overall logical structure. He argues that anti-intellectual movements deeply distort democratic politics by altering how we frame debate.
They take incredibly complex, nuanced policy issues, issues that require careful analysis and compromise, and they frame them as cosmic battles between absolute good and absolute evil.
When a debate over tax policy or foreign relations becomes a cosmic battle between light and dark, the very concept of compromise is destroyed. The book uses a powerful, chilling quote to illustrate this mindset. Who would compromise with Satan?
That quote captures the core danger perfectly. If you are conditioned to believe your political opponent is not just wrong but entirely evil, then any attempt at spirited discussion, negotiation, or finding middle ground policy is seen as a moral betrayal.
An intellectual approach to politics recognizes that conflict is normal and healthy. It values spirited discussion, it respects the messy process of compromise, and crucially, it requires a willingness to revise your own views based on new evidence.
Anti-intellectualism strips all of that away, demanding pure, unyielding ideological loyalty instead.
Yet Hofstadter is incredibly careful to point out some missing views and vital nuances in this narrative. He makes it clear that this isn't just a simple binary story of the uneducated masses attacking the educated elite.
He discusses a concept he brilliantly terms intellectual anti-intellectualism.
What does he mean by that?
This is one of the most fascinating nuances in the text. He shows that anti-intellectualism is actually a recurring temptation inside American culture, and it's a temptation felt even among writers, artists, and thinkers themselves.
There is a long, deeply rooted tradition, heavily influenced by Romanticism, that idealizes natural virtue.
It celebrates the simple, intuitive, uncorrupted individual standing bravely against the artificial corruptions of civilized, highly educated society.
We see this constantly in classic American literature. Think of the transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau retreating to the woods of Walden Pond to escape the intellectual noise of society.
Or consider Mark Twain, who constantly romanticized the simple, intuitive wisdom of a character like Huckleberry Finn, contrasting his natural goodness against the stifling, educated civilization of the Widow Douglas.
It proves that the suspicion of sophisticated formal learning is an internal cultural temptation we all grapple with. It's not just a political battle of the people against the professors.
It's an internal battle for our own cultural identity.
So what does this all mean? How do we take Hofstadter's deep historical analysis from 1964 and practically apply it to how we live and interact today?
For Hofstadter, the implications for living well center on intentionally defending a specific kind of civic ethos. He wants us to build a society where reasoned disagreement, spirited discussion, and the willingness to revise our views are viewed as signs of immense civic strength, not weakness.
We have to stop equating intellectual flexibility or nuance with moral failing.
Precisely.
If you're bringing this book up at a dinner party or discussing it in a classroom, how do you navigate these concepts fairly without sounding dismissive of everyday people?
A fair debate of this book requires holding two competing truths in your mind at the exact same time. First, you must genuinely acknowledge the deeply admirable egalitarian aims of American democracy. We should absolutely honor the wisdom of ordinary experience.
The plain sense of the common person holds incredible, undeniable value in building a functional society. We should never sneer at ordinary, practical intelligence.
But the second truth requires constant vigilance. We have to ensure that our cultural praise of practicality or common sense doesn't become a convenient, respectable cover for fearing moral scrutiny.
We can't let a relentless demand for quick, practical, profitable results prevent us from engaging in the deep, sometimes uncomfortable reflection that a healthy society requires.
We really can't.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today, exploring Hofstadter's profound observation that anti-intellectualism is a recurring temptation in our culture. It's the constant whispered urge to sacrifice reflective, critical thought in exchange for the comfort of absolute certainty, the warmth of group solidarity, and the speed of practical problem solving.
It's a temptation we've faced since the days of early revivals and frontier cabins, all the way through the Cold War.
And it's certainly a tension we navigate in our modern, hyper-connected era.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this raises an important question. Actually, in the spirit of modeling the exact kind of critical thinking Hofstadter champions, this source material leaves us with 4 vital, open questions to carry forward into our own lives and community discussions.
Let's hear them.
Number 1, how can a democracy honor the wisdom of ordinary experience without turning that respect into a blanket suspicion of specialized knowledge? Number 2, when does praise of practicality become a cover for fear of reflection or resistance to moral scrutiny in business and politics?
Number 3, How might religious communities affirm deep faith while also cultivating rigorous, humane intellectual life? And number 4, in today's fast-paced media environment, what concrete practices could help citizens recover an intellectual attitude, meaning curiosity and self-questioning, without drifting into elitism or cynicism?
Those are powerful things to consider.
We highly encourage you to take those 4 questions and ponder them this week. Bring them up with your friends, your family, or your colleagues. Test these ideas out in the real world. Thank you for joining us for this session of Mindful Moments. We hope this exploration has given you a fresh lens through which to view our culture, our shared history, and your daily interactions. We wish you a wonderful and deeply thoughtful week ahead.